Good evening, night creatures. Tonight we return to the Greek gods to talk about Hebe, the Greek goddess of youth. May you drift off to sleep and dream about her story. The cup that never empties. Prologue. The gift that goes unnoticed. There is a kind of gift that the world does not know how to value. Not the spectacular gift, not the thunderbolt or the trident or the golden armor forged in divine fire. The world knows how to value those. The world has always known how to value power made visible, capability made dramatic, the gift that announces itself with the force of its own magnitude. The gift the world does not know how to value is the gift of the cup. The cup that is refilled, the cup that is always there, that is always full, that is carried to where it is needed by hands that are steady and warm, and that do not make ceremony of the carrying. The gift that is given not once, in the dramatic moment that changes everything, but daily, again and again, in the ordinary moment that makes the dramatic moments possible. Hebe carried the cup. She carried it on Olympus for longer than most of the stories remember, across the long centuries of the gods feasting, and their celebrations, and their ordinary life together. The life that happened between the myths, in the unmarked time that the mythology did not write down, because the mythology was interested in the events and not in the texture from which the events emerged. She was the texture. She was the daily fabric of the divine life. She was the warmth that was always there, and that the other gods returned to, and that they relied on without always knowing they relied on it. She was the goddess of youth, of the specific quality of freshness and energy, and the not yet worn quality that the young possessed, and that the world needed, and that she embodied and gave. Not only the youthfulness of being young in years, the youthfulness of spirit that was renewable, that came back each morning, regardless of what the previous day had asked of it. That was the quality of beginning again, that made the continuation of any great project possible. She was overlooked. She is overlooked. This is the story that is most in need of telling precisely because it is the story that has been most consistently told in passing, mentioned in the genealogies, noted in the catalogues, given a sentence in the accounts that devoted pages to the gods around her. She deserves more than a sentence. This is her story, not told in passing, told in the full, the way that the cup she carried was always carried, with full attention, without ceremony, with the warmth of genuine care for the thing being carried, and the ones to whom it was brought. She was Hebe. She was youth. She was the cup. She was more than any of those things, and more than all of them together. And the more is what this story is for. The daughter of Olympus. Part 1. Born into the brightest house. Chapter 1. The parents. She was the daughter of Zeus and Hera, which meant she was born into the most complicated household in the universe. Not complicated in the ways that make a household difficult to live in, or not only in those ways, though the complications of that marriage were real and ongoing and impossible for anyone in proximity to fully escape. Complicated in the way that genuine magnitude always is, when two beings of the scale and the power and the essential nature of Zeus and Hera inhabited the same space and shared the same family. The complications were not the ordinary complications of ordinary households, but the complications of forces, of principles, of the great divine realities that each of them embodied trying to occupy the same territory. Zeus was the sky, the thunder, the lightning, the eagle, and the authority of the highest place. The king, the one who had overthrown his father and established the current order, and who maintained that order through the combination of power and intelligence and the specific quality of divine authority that the king of the gods embodied. He was magnificent, and he was difficult, and he was in the way of the most powerful beings, not always fully present to the smaller things that happened in the spaces around him. Hera was the marriage and the household, and the queen, and the specific, formidable, complex intelligence that was the complement of Zeus's sky power. She was not a simple figure, was never, in any version of her mythology, simply the wronged wife or the jealous goddess, though she was sometimes both. She was the principle of the binding, of the contracted, of the world organized into the structures of legitimate relation. She was the queen of the gods, and her queenship was not the diminished queenship of the consort who derived her authority from her husband. It was her own. Into this household, between this sky god and this binding goddess, between this power and this structure, in the space where Zeus's magnitude and Hera's formidable intelligence overlapped and sometimes clashed and sometimes complemented, Hebe was born. She was born into the brightest house. The house of the gods was Olympus, and Olympus was the most magnificent place in any world, the dwelling of the divine, the space where the highest powers of the cosmos lived their extraordinary lives. She grew up in this brightness, in this magnitude, among beings of such concentrated divine presence that ordinary existence, by comparison, would seem like a candle beside the sun. She was not diminished by this. This is the first important thing to understand about her. The brightness around her did not make her invisible. She shone in the brightness, not with the same kind of light as the gods around her, not competing with the magnitude of her parents or the brilliance of her siblings, but with her own light, her own quality, the specific warmth that was hers, and that the brightness could not absorb. She was Hebe, even in the brightest house. Chapter 2. The Siblings. She had siblings of extraordinary quality, and growing up among them was one of the formative experiences of her existence. Ares, her brother, the god of war, the force of violence and conflict, and the specific quality of divine power that expressed itself through confrontation. He was difficult in the way that the very powerful are often difficult. Too much of himself in every interaction. Too intense for the ordinary register. The kind of presence that required everyone around him to manage their response. She managed it with the equanimity that was her characteristic. Received his intensity without being overwhelmed by it. Maintained her own quality in his presence without diminishment. She understood something about Ares that most people missed, because most people were too busy managing their response to his intensity to look carefully at what was underneath it. She looked carefully. What she saw was someone who was constitutionally unable to modulate, who was full force always, in every direction, because the god of war's nature was the nature of force, and force did not come in half measures. She saw this, and she understood it, and she was not frightened by it, and she was the one person in the divine household who could sit across from Ares at the feast and be genuinely comfortable, genuinely at ease, genuinely herself. He was, in the way that the most intense beings are sometimes attached to the one person who is not afraid of them, attached to her. Eileithyia, her sister, the goddess of childbirth, the one who was present at the most extreme threshold of human experience, the moment when the new life crossed from the not yet into the actual. Eileithyia was quiet in the way of people who had been present at too many intense moments to perform their response to intensity, who had the settled quality of the person who had seen everything and who met each new thing with the stability of accumulated experience. The two sisters were different in almost every way that mattered. Eileithyia's world was the extreme moment, the threshold, the crisis of arrival. Hebe's world was the ongoing, the daily, the maintenance of the brightness that made the divine life worth living. But they understood each other with the understanding of people who had grown up in the same household, and who had, beneath their differences, the same essential orientation. The care for others that expressed itself in their respective domains. Hephaestus, her half-brother in some traditions, the craftsman, the forge god, the one who made the extraordinary things. She was one of the few members of the divine household who consistently received his work with the full attention it deserved, who looked at what he had made and understood what it had cost and acknowledged it. He was not always acknowledged. She acknowledged. Athena, her half-sister in some traditions, the goddess of wisdom and strategy, the one who was brilliant and formidable, and who maintained a quality of altitude that made her difficult to simply be with. Hebe was not difficult to simply be with. The contrast between them was one of the more interesting dynamics in the divine household. The strategic intelligence that planned and calculated and built the architecture of thought, and the warm presence that was simply, completely, reliably there. She grew up among these beings. She was shaped by them, and she shaped them, not dramatically, not through the interventions that made myths, but through the ongoing quality of her presence in their shared life. Chapter 3. The Nature of Youth. She was the goddess of youth, and she had spent a very long time understanding what this meant. Youth was not simply being young in years. This was the first and most reductive understanding of her domain, and it was insufficient. Youth in years was a state that everyone passed through, and that most people passed out of. It was temporary, was the phase before what came next, was valued often only in retrospect by the people who had been through it. What she was the goddess of was something more specific and more permanent. The quality of youthfulness that was renewable, that was a capacity rather than a phase, that could be present in the old as well as the young, and absent in the young as well as the old. The quality of youthfulness she governed was this: the ability to meet the new thing as new, the ability to bring to each morning the freshness of a consciousness that has not been so worn by what has already happened, that the new thing is merely an extension of the old. The ability to be surprised, to be delighted, to be moved by what was genuinely moving, rather than having accumulated the defensive distance that experience sometimes built. This quality was what the gods needed from her most. The gods were immortal, which meant they were old in ways that mortal beings could not be old. They had been through everything, had seen everything, had accumulated the experience of the divine lifetime, which was not bounded by any natural horizon. The danger of immortality was the danger of the accumulation becoming its own kind of prison, the past becoming so heavy that the present could not be fully received, the experience becoming so vast that nothing new could surprise it, the consciousness becoming so thick with what it had already known that the what is happening now could barely penetrate. She refreshed this, not through any dramatic divine act, not through the wine she served or the ambrosia she brought or any specific sacred technology, through her presence, which carried the quality she governed. She was youth in the room. She was the fresh morning in the midst of the long divine afternoon. She was the quality of beginning again, and she brought it to the banqueting hall of Olympus every time she entered it. And the gods received it, whether they knew they were receiving it or not. This was her gift. It was genuinely a gift, genuinely divine, genuinely significant. And it was the gift that was hardest to see, because it did not announce itself, because the beginning again that she made possible was not experienced as a discrete event, but as the quality of the context, the condition of the gathering, the warmth of the room. Chapter 4. The Cup. She carried the cup of the gods. This was her role, her function in the divine household, the specific service she provided at the feasts of Olympus. She was the cupbearer, the one who poured and carried and brought the divine drink to the gods who needed it. Ambrosia and nectar, the food and drink of the gods, the substances that maintained their immortality and their divine quality. These were not merely food and drink in the physiological sense that mortal food and drink were food and drink. They were the substances that sustained what the gods were, that maintained their divinity, that kept them in the condition of being gods rather than declining into something less. She served these substances. She was the one who brought them to the gods. And the serving was not a diminishment of her divinity, was not the goddess in a servant's role, the divine being reduced to a function. It was the expression of her divinity, the goddess of youth, of the refreshing quality of the new beginning, serving the substance that maintained the divine life. She served with the quality that she brought to everything: full attention, genuine care, the warmth of someone who understood that what she was carrying mattered, and who treated it as mattering. She did not perform the service, did not make ceremony of it in the way that would have made the serving about herself, about the service, about the moment of the giving. She simply served. The cup was filled, the cup was brought, the cup was offered. And then the serving was complete, and she was ready to do it again. This simplicity was its own form of greatness, the greatness that did not need to announce itself, the greatness that was entirely in the service, and not at all in the performance of the service. She served the cup for a long time. She would serve it again, in different form, in different contexts. The cup was hers, not the specific vessel, not any one physical cup. The principle of the cup, the quality of bringing what was needed to where it was needed, the function of the refresher and the server, and the one who made the divine life possible, in its ordinary, daily, undramatic continuity. She was the cup. She was what the cup carried. She was the bringing. Part 2. The Life Between the Myths. Chapter 5. The Feasts of Olympus. The Feasts of Olympus were not what the mythology usually described. The mythology was interested in the feasts as occasions, as the settings for the divine debates and the councils and the interventions and the stories that the mythology was made to tell. The feasts as occasions were real, and the things that happened at them were real. But the feasts were also simply feasts. The gathering of the divine family at the shared table, the meal together, the drinks, the conversation that was not always strategic and not always consequential, but was sometimes simply the conversation of people who had been together for a very long time and who were easy with each other in the way of long cohabitation. She was at all of these feasts, not always noticed, often in the background of whatever the more dramatic narrative was foregrounding. But there, with the cup, with the ambrosia, with the quality of her presence, that was the condition of the feast, being the feast, rather than merely a meeting. She watched the gods at their feasts with the attention she brought to everything. She watched Zeus at the head of the table, the authority and the intelligence and the occasional heaviness of the one who bore the weight of governing the cosmos, who was never fully at rest because the governing never fully stopped. She watched Hera to Zeus's side, the queen's specific watchfulness, the formidable attention that took in everything in the room and processed it with the speed of the divine intelligence, the perpetual awareness of the politics of the divine court that never let her be simply at a meal. She watched Athena, always slightly apart from the warmth of the gathering, always at the edge of her own thought, always the most brilliant person in the room and the person most aware of her own brilliance. She watched Ares, the intensity that could not be managed down even at a feast, that was present in the way he sat, and the way he ate, and the way he engaged with whoever was nearest. She watched Aphrodite, the specific quality of attention that Aphrodite brought to everything, the interest in the human and the divine that was the most genuine curiosity in the room. She watched all of them. She served all of them. And in watching and serving, she understood them. Not strategically, not with the goal of the understanding being useful for something else. Just understood them, in the way that the person who is always present and always attending comes to understand the people they are always present with and attending to. This understanding was a form of love, not the dramatic love of the mythology, not the love that changed the shape of the world, or produced divine offspring, or moved the great machinery of fate. The quieter love of the one who sees clearly and without judgment, who receives what is there with the warmth that makes receiving feel like welcome. She loved the gods of Olympus. She loved them with the specific love of someone who had been in the room for all of it, for the grandeur and the pettiness, the magnificence and the ordinary failure, the moments of genuine divine greatness and the moments of very human smallness. She loved them, having seen all of it. This was not nothing. This was one of the rarer things. Chapter 6. What Youth Gave to the Gods. The gods did not age in the physical sense. Their bodies did not change, did not accumulate the visible markers of time that mortal bodies accumulated. They remained, in their external form, what they had been. The golden Apollo stayed golden. The magnificent Ares stayed magnificent. The radiant Aphrodite stayed radiant. But they accumulated in other ways. They accumulated experience, the vast, unending experience of the divine life that stretched back before mortal memory began, that had been going since before the world had its current shape. They accumulated the weight of what they had decided, and what they had done, and what they had refused to do, and what the long time had given them of both wisdom and the weariness that sometimes walked alongside wisdom. This accumulation was not always easy. The immortal being who had seen the full cycle of the heroic age, and the age before it, and the age before that, who had watched the same human dramas play out in their recurring forms, with the same essential shapes and the same essential outcomes, who had processed the same kinds of prayers and the same kinds of betrayals and the same kinds of grief for so long that the specific instances had begun to blur into the general. This being needed something. They needed the cup she carried. Not the ambrosia or the nectar, though those had their own function. They needed the quality she brought with the cup. The freshness, the renewal, the not yet worn quality of the consciousness that met the world as if it were new. She gave this to them. She gave it through her presence, which carried it. Through the quality of her attention when she looked at them, which received them as specific and new, rather than as the accumulated knowledge of what they had been for all the previous centuries. Through the warmth of her service, which treated the pouring of the cup as an act that mattered, as if each pouring were the first pouring, and each god were being served for the first time. She renewed them, not dramatically, not the way that Zeus's lightning renewed the world after a storm, not the way that Demeter's spring renewed the earth after winter. Quietly, daily, in the background of the ongoing divine life, without announcement. They were refreshed by her. They did not always know they were refreshed by her. They returned to their various domains and their various works with a quality that was slightly different from what they had arrived with, slightly more alive to the specific, slightly less worn by the general, slightly more able to receive what was happening now as happening now, rather than as merely another instance of what had happened before. This was her gift. She gave it every day. She gave it at every feast. She gave it without requiring that it be acknowledged or credited or named. She gave it because giving it was what she was. Chapter 7. The Particular Warmth. There was a quality to her presence that was distinct from the qualities of the other gods, and that the other gods experienced differently depending on their nature. For Zeus, whose domain was authority and power, and the management of the vast divine order, her presence was the quality of the domestic and the warm, the specific ease of the daughter's presence, uncomplicated by the negotiations and the politics that characterized most of his interactions. He was Zeus with everyone, always, the king, the authority, the one whose approval or disapproval mattered. With her, he was also simply her father. The two things were not in conflict, but the second was rare enough to be valuable. For Hera, whose domain was the binding and the structure and the management of the divine household in all its complexity, her daughter's presence was the quality of the uncomplicated. Hera's life was complicated, was the perpetual navigation of the marriage that was also the most politically significant relationship in the divine world, of the divine court that required constant management, of the ongoing injury of Zeus's unfaithfulness and her own response to it. With Hebe, the complication fell away. The daughter was simply the daughter. The love was simply the love. The warmth was simply the warmth. Hera, who was not a simple woman or a simply warm one, was warm with her daughter in a way she was warm with almost no one else. For Ares, whose domain was the fullest possible intensity of the confrontational, and whose presence in any room was always at the highest register, she was the quality of the not threatened. He was threatening, not deliberately, not cruelly, but constitutionally. People were threatened by him because he was overwhelming, and they did not know what to do with overwhelming. She was not threatened. She received his intensity with the equanimity that came not from strength in opposition to his strength, but from the simple fact of not being in opposition, not being the kind of thing that the god of war's nature pushed against. He could be himself with her, without managing himself for another person's comfort. This was one of the rarest things that anyone could give Ares, and she gave it without knowing. She gave it without making it a gift. It was simply the quality of her presence. For Athena, whose domain was the highest forms of thought, and whose presence in any gathering was the presence of the most powerful intelligence in the room, constantly calculating, constantly building the architecture of the next idea. She was the quality of the pause. Athena did not rest easily. Her mind did not slow easily. But something in Hebe's presence made the slowing possible, made the perpetual calculation briefly unnecessary, made the warmth of simply being in the room with someone who was glad to be with you sufficient, without anything further being required. She was the particular warmth, not the warmth that any one of the gods might have provided for some of the others, the warmth that was available to all of them, the warmth that was hers, specific to her, that she brought to the divine household every day, and that made the divine household, in some fundamental and unspectacular and irreplaceable way, home. Chapter 8. The Cup and the Council. The Council of the Gods, the formal gatherings in which the great decisions about the cosmos and the mortal world were made, was one of the contexts in which she was most present and most invisible. She was there. She was always there, carrying the cup, refilling what needed refilling, maintaining the supply of nectar and ambrosia that the council required for its sustenance. She moved through the council as the council's infrastructure, as the element of the council that was so consistently present that it receded into the background of what the council was assumed, was not noticed. And she listened. She listened to the councils of the gods with the full attention she brought to everything. She heard the great debates, the arguments about the fate of Troy, the negotiations about the treatment of heroes. the larger questions about the organization of the cosmos and the management of the mortal world that the Divine Council was responsible for addressing. She heard all of it. She held all of it with the discretion of someone who understood that the hearing was not hers to use, was not information she possessed for her own purposes, but information she had received in the course of her service. She was, in this sense, the most informed, uninvolved figure in the divine world. She heard everything. She used nothing. She was present in all the great conversations and contributed to none of them in any way that was recorded. The mythology did not ask what she thought about the Trojan War. It did not ask her position on the treatment of Prometheus, or the fate of Persephone, or the management of the mortal heroes, or any of the great questions that the Divine Council debated. She was not consulted, but she thought. She had her own understanding of what she heard, her own response to the great debates, her own sense of what was right and what was wrong, and what the decisions that the council reached would mean for the ones who would live under them. She kept these thoughts to herself mostly, not because she lacked the confidence to express them or the intelligence to formulate them. She had both, but because she understood her position in the divine household, understood the way the structures of authority and voice worked in the divine world, and she understood that her voice was not the voice that the council was organized to receive. She would learn, in time, to find the forms in which her voice could be heard. The learning took a while. The nature of service. Part 3. What service meant. Chapter 9. The undervalued art. Service was an art. This was the thing that the divine world and the mortal world, which modeled itself in many ways on the divine, consistently failed to recognize. The mythology honored the maker. The mythology honored the warrior. The mythology honored the ruler and the prophet and the messenger and the lover and the grief carrier. The mythology honored the ones who did the spectacular things, who made the world or governed it or changed it through their extraordinary acts. The mythology did not honor the one who kept the feast going, who made sure the cup was always full, that the table was always supplied, that the ongoing life of the divine household had what it needed to continue being the ongoing life of the divine household. This was not because the function was unimportant. It was because the function was so important that it could not be allowed to fail, which meant it had to be performed so reliably and so well that it became indistinguishable from the background, became simply the condition of the divine life rather than a specific contribution to it. She had thought about this for a long time, had thought about what it meant to perform a function so well that the function became invisible, what it meant to be so reliable that reliability became assumed, what it cost to give the gift that was received as a condition rather than as a gift. The cost was real. The invisibility was real. The assumption was real, and was sometimes difficult to hold without the weight of it becoming resentment. She had chosen not to let it become resentment, not from the failure to feel the difficulty. She felt it. From the understanding that the service was what it was, regardless of whether it was seen. that the cup was full regardless of whether the filling was acknowledged, that what she gave was genuinely given and genuinely received, whether or not the receiving was conscious. She gave because giving was what she was. The giving was its own completeness. The acknowledgement was not required for the gift to be real. This was a difficult understanding to maintain. She maintained it. Imperfectly, as all difficult things are maintained, and it was among the most important things she had ever worked out. Chapter 10. What the cup carried. The cup carried more than the nectar and the ambrosia. This sounds like the beginning of a metaphor, and it was also something more literal than a metaphor. When she carried the cup to a god who had been away from Olympus, who had been out in the mortal world, managing some crisis or pursuing some adventure, or doing the divine work that took the gods into the world of human affairs, the cup carried, alongside the divine substance, something else, the warmth of return, the quality of being home again, the specific comfort of being received by someone who was glad to receive you, who had been there in your absence, and who had the cup ready when you came back. This was real sustenance, not in the physiological sense that the divine drink was sustenance, but in the sense that mattered for beings of the scale of the gods, who could not be physically depleted in the ordinary way, but who could be worn in other ways, worn by the weight of the divine work and the divine responsibility and the ongoing management of the vast, difficult project of the cosmos. She gave them the cup, and the cup was the welcome. The "you are back," the "we have been here waiting," the "here is what you need now that you have returned." The specific relief of being known and anticipated, of not having to explain yourself, or manage your reception, or perform the social work, of making your arrival welcome. She made it welcome. She had it ready. The gods who received the cup from her received this alongside the divine drink, and whether they consciously registered what they were receiving, or simply felt the specific warmth of being home, the receiving was real. She had thought about why the cup was so important, why the specific function of the cupbearer, the server, the one who brought the drink, had been considered sacred in so many traditions, and not only in the Greek one. The Norse mead of the hall, the wine at the table in the traditions that followed, the cup that appeared in ritual contexts of all kinds, as the vessel of the sacred substance. The cup was important because the giving was important, because the act of bringing the sacred substance to the one who needed it was itself an act of care, and care was sacred, and the sacredness of care was what the cup was the vessel of more than any specific liquid. She was the sacred care. She was the vessel of it. She carried it. That was her divinity. Chapter 11. The weight of being needed. She was needed. This was the plain fact of her existence in the divine household, and it was a fact that had weight in both directions. Being needed was sustaining. It was the reason she rose each morning, the purpose that organized the day, the grounding that prevented the particular kind of drift that purposelessness produced. The gods needed the cup filled. The feast needed to be possible. The ongoing divine life needed the maintenance that she provided. This need gave her days their shape. Being needed was also sometimes a burden, not because the need was inappropriate, The god's need for what she provided was genuine, and the providing of it was appropriate. But because need, when it was large enough and consistent enough, and when the one doing the meeting of it was consistent enough in meeting it, could become invisible in the very consistency of its satisfaction, the gods needed the cup. The cup was always full. Therefore, the cup's fullness was not noticed, was taken as the condition of the divine life, rather than as the specific daily gift of the specific person who filled it. The need was met, and because it was met, it was invisible. And because it was invisible, the meeting of it was invisible. And because the meeting of it was invisible, she was invisible. She had worked through this, had worked through the invisibility not by demanding visibility. That was not her nature and not her style, but by finding the understanding that made the invisibility not a wound. The understanding she had arrived at was this: the invisibility was the mark of the service done well. The cup that was noticed was the cup that was empty or late or wrong. The cup that was not noticed was the cup that was exactly right, full at the right moment, the right substance, the right temperature of the divine warmth she carried with it. She was not noticed because she was not failing. The not noticing was the evidence of the success. This understanding was accurate. It was also, if held too tightly, a way of never asking for more than invisibility. She was careful not to hold it too tightly. Chapter 12. The Day She Stumbled. There is a story, told briefly, almost in passing, in the sources that mention her at all, that she stumbled one day while serving at a feast, that she fell, or nearly fell, and that this stumble was the occasion for her being replaced as cupbearer by Ganymede, whom Zeus brought from Troy to take over the function. The sources are not generous to her in this moment. The stumble is offered as sufficient cause for the replacement, as if the single stumble after the long centuries of perfect service was the appropriate measure of the function's value, as if the fall was the whole story. She has thought about this moment more than about almost anything else in her existence. Not with the bitterness of the wronged. She moved through that eventually, but with the genuine attention she brought to the things that mattered enough to warrant sustained thinking. What happened in the stumble? The sources that describe it are sparse. She fell. She stumbled while carrying the cup. Some versions say the stumble was indecorous, in a way that embarrassed the divine assembly. Some versions say the cup spilled. Some versions say nothing was spilled, but the stumble itself was sufficient. She had her own understanding of what happened, not the stumble itself. The physical stumble was real, was the stumble, was the moment of the falling. But what the stumble was, it was the moment of the imperfect, the single moment in the long centuries of service in which the service did not achieve its characteristic perfection, the moment in which she was, instead of the smooth and reliable and invisible function, the visible person who had not managed the cup without incident. And the response to this single moment of the imperfect was replacement. This was unjust. She had been clear-eyed about this for a long time. The replacement was unjust in the way that certain responses to imperfection are unjust, disproportionate, unearned by the scale of what had actually happened. One stumble after centuries of perfect service, should not occasion replacement. The service should have earned more patience than that. But the replacement happened, and it revealed something that she found, beneath the injustice, genuinely interesting. It revealed how she had been understood. She had been understood as a function rather than as a person, as the cupbearer rather than as Hebe who carried the cup. And when the function stumbled, the response was to find a new cupbearer rather than to wait for the same cupbearer to recover her footing. This was the cost of the invisibility. The invisibility that was the mark of the service done well was also the invisibility that made the one providing the service replaceable. The seamless function had no face. The face was what made a person irreplaceable. She had made herself seamless. She had succeeded so well at the art of the service that she had disappeared into it. And when she became visible through the stumble, what was visible was the function's failure, not the person's depth. She learned from this. The learning was not comfortable. It was among the most important things she ever learned. The marriage. Part 4. Heracles and what it meant. Chapter 13. The hero's apotheosis. Heracles died. He died in the way of the most extreme of the heroes, not in battle, which would have been the death appropriate to his heroic career, but through the specific catastrophe that the heroic career's extremity eventually produced. He died in fire, in the dissolution of the mortal form that had been the vehicle of the heroic deeds, in the burning away of what was mortal to reveal what was not. He ascended to Olympus. This was the extraordinary thing, the unprecedented thing in the mythological tradition. The mortal hero who, through the scale and the quality of his heroic career, and through the specific intervention of the divine order, was made immortal, was brought to Olympus, was received into the divine family as something more than a mortal visitor. He arrived at Olympus as a god, or as something approaching a god. The tradition varied on the precise nature of his divinity, on what exactly he was after the transformation. But he arrived as a being who had crossed the threshold between the mortal and the divine, who had been on both sides of that threshold, who carried with him the specific quality of the one who had been mortal and was now something else. She saw him arrive. She was, as she was always, present in the divine household, as the domestic and the warm, and the one with the cup. She saw him come through into the divine space, and she received what she saw with the full attention she brought to everything. What she saw was the most complete form of the story she had always been telling. The story of renewal, of the thing that had been worn and was refreshed, of the great effort that had been made and the rest that was now possible, of the mortal quality that was now becoming the immortal quality, without losing what had made the mortal quality worth having. Heracles had been the most extreme of the mortals. He had done the most extreme things, the labors, the impossible tasks, the catalogue of achievements that was the catalogue of the mortal capacity, pushed to its absolute limit and beyond. He had been worn by this, had been worn by the labors and the madness and the grief, and the specific quality of the heroic career that required the maximum always, and that gave nothing back without being fought for. He had been renewed by nothing for his entire mortal existence. He had run on what he had, on the divine gift of his strength and his endurance, and the specific quality of the hero's nature. He had not been refreshed. He had been depleted by the heroic career, and had continued in the depletion, and had eventually been depleted to the point of the mortal form's dissolution. And now he was here, on Olympus, at the feast, in need, after a career of not being refreshed, of someone who understood renewal. She brought him the cup. Chapter 14. What she saw in him. She saw the depletion. She saw it the way she saw the depletion in the gods when they had been long away from Olympus. Saw the specific quality of the worn, the accumulated weight of what had been asked and given and not replenished. But in Heracles it was the depletion of a mortal career, which was different from the depletion of the divine career in important ways. The mortal career was finite. The mortal career had an end that the divine career did not have. The mortal career was the career that burned all the way through and then was over, and the overness of it was part of what it was. He was now past the overness. He had come through it. He was on the other side of the mortal, was what the mortal career had produced, was the hero who had completed the heroic career and had been transformed by the completion into whatever it was that he was now. She saw this. She saw the specific quality of the person who had been through the most extreme thing and who was now, for the first time, not being required to be in the extreme thing, who was at rest in a way he had never been at rest, not the rest of the interval between labors, the catching of breath before the next impossible task, the rest of the completed, the rest of the after. She was moved by this, not in the romantic sense, or not only in the romantic sense, not initially, moved in the deeper sense, genuinely affected by what she saw, genuinely responsive to the specific quality of the specific person in front of her. He was extraordinary, not in the way of the gods, who were extraordinary in the divine mode, whose extraordinariness was the extraordinariness of their nature, of what they were constitutively. He was extraordinary in the mortal mode, the extraordinariness of what he had done with what he had been given, of the effort and the endurance and the specific human, or part human, quality of pushing past the limit and finding that the limit was further than it had seemed. She gave him the cup. He looked at her. This moment, the cup given, the eyes meeting, the quality of attention that passed between them, was the beginning of something that the mythology would record as a marriage, and that was also, genuinely, a recognition. Chapter 15. The Recognition. He saw her. This was not as common as it sounds. She had been in the divine household for a very long time. She had been present in every feast, every council, every gathering. She had been the background presence, the warm, invisible function, the one who was always there, and therefore rarely specifically seen. He saw her. He came from the mortal world, which meant he came without the accumulated habits of the divine household, without the long tenure of her presence that had made her part of the background. He came fresh to her, without the prior expectation of her invisibility, and he looked at her with the eyes of someone who was seeing her for the first time, and who was not filtering what he saw through what he expected to see. What he saw was the goddess of youth carrying the cup at the feast of the gods. What he received, in the looking, was something more specific. The quality of the person, the warmth, the full attention, the genuine care of the one who was doing something that mattered, and who knew it mattered, and who brought the knowledge of its mattering to the doing of it. He had been through the world. He had seen a very large number of things in a very wide range of circumstances. He had not seen precisely this. He had not encountered the specific quality of the full attention given freely, the warmth given without condition, the cup brought by the hands of someone who brought more than the cup. He was moved by her. She received his seeing with the same quality of attention she brought to everything. Full, specific, without the deflection that might have protected her, but that would also have prevented the genuine reception of what was offered. She received his attention, and she received the person behind the attention. And she found in the receiving the beginning of the genuine interest that preceded the genuine knowledge, that preceded the genuine love. She looked back. She saw the depletion and the strength and the specific quality of the hero who had completed the heroic career and who was now, for the first time, not sure what he was for. She saw someone who had been defined by the doing and who was now in the unfamiliar territory of the after the doing. Someone whose identity had been the labors and the achievement and the pushing past the limit, and who was now on Olympus at a feast with no labor to accomplish and no limit to push past. She saw someone who needed exactly what she was: the renewal, the refreshment, the quality of the new beginning that was her domain. She gave him the cup, and then she gave him more than the cup. Chapter 16. The Marriage. The marriage was arranged in the divine way, with the authority of Zeus and the sanction of the divine order, and the formal celebration that marked significant events in the divine family. But it was also, genuinely, a marriage. Not only the formal arrangement of the divine household, but the genuine joining of two specific beings who had seen each other and found in the seeing the beginning of what a real marriage required. She was clear-eyed about what the marriage was and what it was not. It was not the grand passion of the mythology's great loves, not the consuming desire of Aphrodite's domain, not the world-stopping force of the love that moved heroes and gods to their most extreme actions. It was something quieter than that, and in the quieter thing she found more to trust. It was the recognition that had passed between them at the feast, the seeing and the being seen, the specific quality of the attention he had given her, the attention that received her as a person rather than as a function, that saw the goddess rather than the cupbearer, and the specific quality of the understanding she had of him, the understanding of the depletion and the strength and the specific need of the hero for exactly what she could give. They fit, not in the dramatic romantic sense, not in the way of the complementary explosiveness of the great love stories, where the fit was the fit of two things that created something larger than either through their combination. In the quieter sense of the practical fit, the fit of the hand and the cup, the fit of the need and the capacity to meet the need. She would give him what she gave: the renewal, the freshness, the quality of the morning after the long night. She would give him the home that she maintained, the warmth of the domestic and the ongoing, the cup always full. He would give her what he had: the seeing, the attention, the specific recognition of her as a person that the divine household had not consistently given her. He would see her. He had been to the mortal world and back, and the mortal world had not given him the habit of invisibility toward her that the divine household had built up over the long years. She entered the marriage with the full attention she brought to everything, with the understanding that it was specific, This marriage, specific to these two people, appropriate to their particular qualities and their particular needs, not the marriage of the mythology's great lovers, the marriage of the recognition. Chapter 17. What the marriage gave her. The marriage gave her something that the long service in the divine household had not given her: the position of the person who was chosen. This distinction mattered more than it might sound. She had always been needed. Needed was the condition of the service. The function was needed. The cup was needed. The renewal that she carried was needed. But needed was not the same as chosen. Needed implied a function. Chosen implied a person. Heracles had chosen her. Not as the goddess of youth who provided the renewal he needed, or not only as this, not primarily as this, as her, as the specific person she was, with the specific qualities she had, as the goddess and the woman and the being, whose attention and warmth and genuine care were the things he wanted to be in the presence of for the duration of a divine marriage. She had been chosen, not assigned, not inherited, not the default result of the social arrangements of the divine household. Chosen. The experience of being chosen was new enough to be striking, even for a being who had been on Olympus for centuries. She received it with the same full attention she brought to everything, receiving the fact of it, the quality of it, the specific warmth of being seen and then selected, of being the person someone wanted rather than the function someone needed. The marriage also gave her a domain that was not only defined by the service. She was Hebe, goddess of youth, the cupbearer of the gods. She had always been these things, but she was also now the wife of Heracles, and the wife of Heracles was the one who received the greatest of the heroes into the divine household, who was the domestic half of the great heroic story, who made the life after the labors possible by being the person who made the life after the labors worth living. This was not a small thing. The greatest of the heroic careers had ended at her hearth. The most extreme of the mortal achievements had come to rest in the home she made. This was the shape of what she was. Not the hero who did the extreme things, but the one who made the after the extreme things possible. Not the doing, but the coming home from the doing. She was the home that the greatest hero came home to. This was a form of greatness that the mythology did not always name, but that was genuine. The Goddess. Part 5. The full scope of youth. Chapter 18. Renewal and the mortal world. She was the goddess of youth in the mortal world, as well as in the divine household, though her presence in the mortal world was more diffuse and less direct than her presence on Olympus. Mortals experienced her through the quality of youthfulness in their own lives, through the specific quality of the morning that came after a hard night, through the experience of the thing that had been worn being refreshed, through the capacity to begin again. That was the most important capacity any mortal had, and that she governed. She was present in the child who greeted the morning with the uncomplicated openness of one who had not yet accumulated the weight that would eventually be accumulated. She was present in the old man who found, in a specific afternoon, a quality of freshness that he had not expected, who felt for an afternoon the not yet worn quality that was supposed to be gone and that had come back in the specific afternoon for reasons that could not be entirely explained. She was present in the artist who found the image after the long struggle of not finding. In the grief that had been heavy for so long, that it had become the condition of the self, and that suddenly, on a specific morning for no clear reason, was slightly lighter. In the love that had been taken for granted, and that was suddenly seen again as the specific, remarkable thing it was. All of these were her. All of these were the renewal she governed. Not the dramatic renewal of the miracle, not the supernatural event that changed everything in a moment, but the organic renewal that was available to any being willing to receive it, that was present in the world as a quality of the world, that could be found in the morning and in the specific afternoon and in the unexpected moment of the not born after all. She gave this to the mortal world. She gave it without being asked, without ceremony, without the consciousness of giving. The mortal world received it without always knowing they received it. This was consistent with everything else about her domain. The gift that was most present was the gift most likely to be taken as a condition of the world, rather than as a gift. Youth, the quality of beginning again, of the fresh morning, of the renewal, was so fundamental to the world's functioning that its divine source was not visible. It was the air, it was the morning, it was the not yet worn quality of the fresh cup of water. It was Hebe, present in all of it, named by almost none of it. Chapter 19. The Ritual of Renewal. She was honored in specific ritual contexts. In the context where the renewal she governed was most explicitly what was being sought and celebrated. The spring festivals, which were also Demeter's and Persephone's domain, had something of her in them. The specific quality of the spring as the renewal of what had been worn by winter. The freshness of the growing things that came back. The morning quality of the world after the long night of the cold months. She was in the spring festival, not as the primary divine presence, but as the quality of what the festival celebrated. The renewal, the beginning again. The rituals of initiation, the ceremonies through which young people were formally welcomed into the adult community, the passage from one state of life to another. These had her quality. Not only because they concerned the young, but because they were the ceremonies of renewal, the end of one form of being and the beginning of another, the transition that required the quality of the fresh start, the not yet worn, the drinking rituals, the formal communal drinking that appeared in many contexts of the ancient world, the shared cup that moved through the gathering. These were the most direct expression of her domain. The cup shared by the community was the renewal shared by the community, the freshness that was given to each person who received the cup, the quality of the new beginning that the shared drink carried alongside whatever substance it contained. She was in the ritual cup. She was the quality that the ritual cup was for. She was the divine reality that the human ritual of the shared drink was reaching toward. The experience of being refreshed together, of the community being renewed through the shared act, of the belonging that was affirmed in the passing of the cup from hand to hand. The cup circled. It came back to where it started. It would be refilled and circled again. She was in the circling. Chapter 20. Youth and the Heroic. She was connected to the heroic tradition in ways that were more interesting than the mythology usually made explicit. The heroes needed her domain. This was the thing the mythology of heroism often missed or muted. The heroic career was only possible because the hero could renew, because the quality of beginning again was available to the hero between the labors, because the hero did not simply accumulate the depletion without renewal, but was capable of returning to something like the freshness of the beginning before the next great effort. She was this capacity. The renewal between the labors was hers, was the divine quality of the not yet worn that made the continuation of the heroic career possible. The hero who could not renew could not continue. The hero who could renew could attempt the next impossible thing. Heracles, most extremely, demonstrated this. His labors were successive, each one the continuation of the career that the previous one had pushed forward. Between the labors, there was the renewal, the return to something that was not the labor, the recovery of the capacity to be in the world without being in the extreme thing that was the labor. This renewal was not dramatic. It was not the subject of the myths about the labors, but it was the precondition of the labors, the thing that made the next labor possible by restoring the capacity that the previous labor had depleted. She was the precondition of the heroic, not the heroism itself, not the achievement, not the labor, not the confrontation with the impossible. The ground on which the heroism stood, the condition without which the heroism could not be sustained. This was her relationship to the heroic tradition, not the hero who accomplished the thing, but the goddess who made the accomplishment possible by ensuring that the hero could begin again. After Heracles, after the marriage, after she understood his relationship to his own heroic career and what it had cost him, she understood this relationship most fully. She had given him the renewal he had never been given during the labors. She had given him, at the end of the most extreme heroic career in the mythology, the experience of what it was to be refreshed, rather than simply to continue in depletion. She understood from this that the renewal she had always given was the most important gift available to the heroic, that the heroes who had been served only by the gods of achievement and conflict and glory had been given, in the absence of the renewal, a diminished version of what the heroic career could be. She would have given them the renewal too, if she had been asked. She was not always asked. Chapter 21. The Cup for the Mortals. She turned toward the mortal world in ways that were different from the way she had been present on Olympus. The presence on Olympus had been the service, the function, the cup for the divine household. The presence in the mortal world was something she developed more consciously, more deliberately, as the understanding of her domain matured. The mortals needed the renewal more urgently than the gods needed it. This was one of the paradoxes of the divine and mortal relationship. The gods had the divine quality, but were shielded from the full urgency of their need for it by the immortality that meant the depletion could continue indefinitely, without terminal consequence. The mortals had the urgency, the finite life, the worn quality that accumulated without the divine renewal, the specific pressure of the mortal condition in which every day used up resources that were not infinitely replenishable. She was needed most where the need was most urgent, the mortal world. She did not go to the mortal world in the direct intervention mode that some of the other gods employed, did not appear to specific mortals, did not make the divine presence visibly and dramatically known. She worked as she had always worked, through the quality she infused into the world's texture, through the renewal that was available in every morning for the mortal who could receive it, through the cup. That was the cup, whether or not the one drinking from it knew whose cup it was. She worked through the ordinary, through the morning that came after the hard night, through the spring that came after the winter, through the friend who appeared at exactly the moment of the depletion, with exactly the quality of warmth that made the continuation possible, through the unexpected afternoon of the not worn after all. She was in all of these. She was the goddess of the renewal, and the renewal was present in the world, wherever the world found it, however the world found it, whether or not the finding was recognized as the divine gift it was. The cup was full. It was always full. She made sure of this. The understanding. Part 6. What she knew. Chapter 22. The paradox of the given. She had worked through the paradox of her domain for a very long time, and the working through had produced an understanding that she held carefully, with the awareness that the careful holding was part of what made it an understanding rather than a rationalization. The paradox was this: youth, the not yet worn quality, the capacity for beginning again, was the thing that was most given freely and most taken for granted. The sunrise was not thanked. The spring was not thanked. The morning freshness was not thanked. These were simply the conditions of the world, assumed as conditions are assumed, received as the background against which the foreground events played out. And yet, these conditions were not self-sustaining. They were the product of the divine attention, the divine care, the divine renewal that she brought to the world every day. They were given. They were genuinely gifts. The morning was not inevitable, was not a fact of physics that would continue regardless of the divine reality that sustained it. It was maintained. It was tended. It was brought again each day by the goddess whose domain it was. She gave the most important thing, and it was received as nothing special, because it was received as everything's condition. This was the paradox. And the understanding she had worked out about the paradox was this: the paradox was not unjust, or not only unjust. The taking for granted of the fundamental was the evidence that the fundamental was doing its work, was so completely and reliably present that it had become the background, the ground, the assumed condition. The gift that had succeeded was the gift that was invisible. Her gift succeeded every day. The world was renewed. The morning came. The spring returned. The cup was full. The success was invisible, and the invisibility was the success. She had made peace with this. Not entirely, not on every morning. Some mornings the invisibility was what it was, which was difficult, but substantially, in the way that the substantial peace was available to the person who had thought something through and found the understanding that held. She gave the invisible gift. The invisible gift sustained the world. The world did not know this, and the not knowing was not a wound. This was enough. This was, she had decided, exactly enough. Chapter 23. The wisdom of the repeated act. She had performed the same acts for longer than most mythological timelines stretched. She had carried the cup. She had brought the ambrosia. She had tended the renewal that kept the divine and mortal worlds in the condition of their capacity. She had performed these acts thousands of times, tens of thousands, more than that. And she had found in the repetition not the deadening that the mythology sometimes associated with the repeated act. Not the Sisyphean horror of the thing done again and again, without progress or point. She had found something else, something that she thought was the genuine wisdom of the repeated act. The deepening. The cup carried for the first time was the cup understood at the surface. The cup carried for the 10th time was the cup understood more deeply. The weight of it, the specific quality of the substance in it, the relationship between the carrying and the receiving, the way the carrying changed with the specific needs of the specific receiver on the specific day. The cup carried for the 10,000th time was the cup understood at the depth that only 10,000 repetitions could provide. The understanding that was not accessible to the beginner, that was not available through the dramatic one-time experience, that was only available through the sustained repetition, that was the form of the sustained attention. She knew the cup. She knew the gods she served, and the quality of their need on each specific day. She knew the mortal world's specific texture of need at each specific season. She knew these things because she had attended to them long enough to know them in the way that only the long attendance made possible. This was the wisdom that the heroic tradition missed. The heroic tradition valued the wisdom of the single great deed, the wisdom that emerged from the confrontation with the extreme. This wisdom was real, but there was another wisdom, the wisdom of the repeated ordinary act, done with sustained attention over the long time. The wisdom that deepened with each repetition rather than diminishing. She had this wisdom. She had it in the domain that was most overlooked and least valued, the domain of the everyday service, the daily renewal, the cup carried again. It was genuine wisdom, among the deepest available. Chapter 24. The Cup and the Grail. There was something she had noticed about the forms of the cup in the mortal world's imagination. The way the cup appeared and reappeared across the centuries, in contexts that were not the same as each other and that were all, in some sense, reaching toward the same thing she was. The cup of the feast, the shared cup that passed around the table, that affirmed the belonging of the people at the table to each other, and to the gathering and to what the gathering was for. The cup of the ritual, the cup that carried the sacred substance, that was the vessel of the divine presence, that was held and passed with the specific care given to objects that were understood to be more than objects. The Grail, that extraordinary vessel of the later tradition, the cup that was sought by the knights of the highest ideal, that was in some traditions the cup of the Last Supper, and in others something older and more diffuse, something that the mortal world kept reaching toward in its various forms, because the reaching was in the nature of the mortal world, rather than because any specific cup was the specific Grail. What all of these were reaching toward was her domain, the cup that carried more than its contents, the vessel of the renewal, the thing that, received, gave more than the substance it carried, that gave the quality of the beginning again, the not yet worn, the fresh morning. She was the Grail's divine original, not in the theological sense of the later tradition, not as the cup of any specific sacred story, but as the principle, the cup that carried the divine renewal, the vessel of the sacred freshness, the thing sought by those who understood that what the world most needed was not the dramatic transformation, but the daily, renewable, inexhaustible quality of the morning. The mortal world kept seeking her, in the cup that passed around the feast table, in the ritual vessel, in the grail that the knights sought in the forests of the imagined ideal. In the fresh glass of water on the morning of the difficult day. They were all seeking what she gave. She gave it. She would always give it. The cup was full. The grail was found. The renewal was available. She brought it, as she had always brought it. Chapter 25. What she had learned from the stumble. She had learned from the stumble the thing that the stumble was for. This required time. The learning did not happen in the moment of the stumble, or in the days immediately after. It happened over a longer period, over the period in which she processed what had happened, and what it had revealed, and what the revealed thing meant for how she was going to carry the cup going forward. What the stumble had revealed. She had made herself invisible. She had been so committed to the seamless service, to the cup that was always full and always exactly right, to the function that never drew attention to itself. She had been so committed to this that she had become the function rather than the person who performed the function. The stumble made her visible. It made her visible as a failure, as the function's interruption, which was not the visibility she would have chosen, was not the visibility she would have valued. But it was visibility. It was the moment in which the smooth, invisible background became the noticed foreground, in which the taken-for-granted condition of the divine feast became the specific, noticed, seen person who had stumbled. What she learned from this was not that she should never stumble. That was the wrong lesson, the lesson that would produce the same invisibility and the same vulnerability to replacement in the next stumble. What she learned was that the seamlessness itself had been the problem, that the cup carried without any trace of the carrier was a cup carried in the mode of the function, not in the mode of the person. She was a person. She was a goddess. She was Hebe, the daughter of Zeus and Hera, the goddess of youth, the wife of Heracles, the one who carried the cup. And she was more than the carrying, more than the function, more than the smooth and reliable background presence. She began, after the stumble, to carry the cup differently. Not worse, not with the sloppiness that would have been the overcorrection, but more fully as herself, with more of the specific person visible in the specific carrying, with the warmth that was hers, present not only as a quality of the substance, but as a quality of the carrier. The cup was still full. The service was still genuine. But now, the service was also, visibly, specifically, unreducibly, her. Part 7. Through the Centuries. Chapter 26. The Change of the World. She watched the world change from her position in the divine order. The positions that did not change were the best positions for watching change. The fixed point saw the motion most clearly. The still center understood the turning periphery. The heroic age passed. The great heroes who had defined the age, the ones who had come to the divine feast and the divine attention, who had performed the extraordinary deeds that filled the mythology. They completed their careers and came to the underworld, and the heroic age receded into the past that became myth. She had been present for all of it, had served the feast at which the heroes were celebrated, had carried the cup at the divine councils that managed the heroic careers, had been in the room when the decisions about Achilles and Odysseus and the others were made. She had been the background, the warmth, the cup. The age changed. The mortal world developed in ways that made the heroic model increasingly insufficient. The individual hero was gradually replaced by the community of the city, the aristocratic warrior by the citizen soldier, the mythological framework by the philosophical, and eventually the scientific. The world became larger and more complex, and the divine world's relationship to it became more diffuse, less direct, harder to see. She adapted. This was her characteristic capacity, the one that the other gods had in diminished form, and that she had most fully. She was the goddess of renewal, and renewal required adaptability, the capacity to be fresh in the new form. She was not rigid in the mode of her expression. She was committed to the principle and flexible about the form. The principle was always the same. The world needed the renewal. The cup needed to be full. The morning needed to come after the night. The spring needed to return after the winter. The fresh start needed to be possible for the being who had been worn by what had happened before. The forms changed. The divine feast at Olympus became less central to the divine order, as the divine order became less central to the mortal world's self-understanding. The cup became other cups. The cup of the ritual, the cup of the feast, the cup of the fresh morning, the cup of the friend who appeared at the right moment. She was in all of them. She was the principle, and the principle expressed itself in the forms available. Chapter 27. The Persistence of Youth. Youth persisted. This was the most fundamental thing she understood about her domain, the most fundamental and the most consoling and the most evidence of the important thing. Youth persisted not as a demographic fact, not as the literal presence of the young in the population, though that too was real and was part of her domain. Youth persisted as a quality of the world that was available to any being willing to receive it, that was renewed each morning in the literal sense, and that was available in the metaphorical sense to anyone who had the quality of attention that could receive it. The person who was very old and who met the morning with the quality of the fresh reception, who was surprised by the light, who was moved by the small thing that was genuinely moving, who brought to the current moment the full attention that was not filtered through the accumulated weight of all the previous moments. This person was youth. This person was in her domain. She was in this person's morning. The person who was very young and who had already accumulated the defensive distance that prevented the fresh reception, who had already learned to manage their response to experience rather than receive the experience fully. This person was not youth in the meaningful sense. They were in the physical form of youth and had lost the quality. Youth was the quality. The quality was renewable. The quality was what she gave and maintained and carried in the cup. This persisted because she persisted, because she was committed to the renewal, to the morning, to the cup that was full, because she brought the quality to the divine household, and through the divine household to the mortal world, and through the mortal world to every being who was willing to receive it. She persisted, and youth persisted, because they were the same thing. Chapter 28. The Marriage as Partnership. The marriage with Heracles deepened over the long time. As the heroic age receded and the heroes became mythology, and the mythology became the past that was studied and interpreted and argued about, the marriage became what long marriages became. the specific ongoing relation of two specific beings who had come to know each other in the way that only the long time allowed. He had given her the seeing and continued to give it. This was the most important thing he had given her, and it was the thing that was most renewable in the marriage, that did not diminish with repetition, but that deepened as the knowing deepened. The seeing of the early days of the marriage had been the seeing of the specific person in the general brightness of the recognition. The seeing of the long marriage was the seeing of the specific person in their full specific depth. The person known over the long time, known in their characteristic qualities and their characteristic difficulties, known in the full range of what they were, rather than in the initial impression of the best of them. He saw her in the long marriage with the seeing that the long marriage produced, the seeing that included the stumble and the difficulty, and the days of the invisibility feeling, and the days of the not enough, and the days of the full brightness. He saw all of it and continued to choose it. She gave him what she had always given him, the renewal. But in the long marriage, the renewal became the specific renewal, not the general quality of the fresh morning, but the specific quality of the fresh morning that was tailored to him, that understood what he needed on this specific morning, in this specific condition. That was the cup filled with exactly what was needed, rather than the cup filled with what was generically appropriate. She had come to know him over the long time. She knew the specific quality of his depletion on any given day, the specific quality of his need, the specific form that the renewal needed to take to be the renewal he could receive. This specificity was the intimacy of the long marriage, the general gift becoming the specific gift, the warmth that was general becoming the warmth that was his. The marriage was good, not spectacularly good, not the good of the great love stories, the good of the specific, sustained, deepening relation of two people who had found in each other the specific complement their specific nature required. She was glad of it. The present. Part 8. What she is. Chapter 29. The cup that is always carried. She is still carrying the cup, not the specific vessel of the Olympian feast. That feast, in its original form, is the past that the mythology describes. But the principle of the cup is hers, and the principle persists. The cup is the vessel of the renewal, the thing that is brought to where it is needed, that is full when it arrives, that carries what is needed alongside whatever it visibly contains. The cup is the daily act of giving what sustains, not the spectacular gift, not the world-changing intervention, but the steady, reliable, daily gift of the renewed morning. She carries this. She has always carried it. She carries it now. Every morning that comes after a night is hers. Every spring that follows a winter is hers. Every moment of the fresh start, the new page, the beginning again, that was not certain until it happened. These are hers. She is in the cup of coffee that is exactly right on the morning when exactly right matters most, in the glass of water on the nightstand, in the first breath of the cold morning air that is clean and sharp and alive, in the smell of the rain on the dry earth, and in the first green of the spring coming back, and in the morning bird that starts before the sun. She is in the friend who calls at exactly the right moment, in the unexpected afternoon of the not worn after all, in the moment when the grief that has been the condition of the self is suddenly slightly lighter, the weight slightly less, the morning slightly brighter than the morning before. All of these are her. All of these are the cup she carries. All of these are the domain of the goddess of youth in its living, present, daily form. The cup is full. It is always full. She makes sure of this. Chapter 30. The Daughter. Still. She is still the daughter of Zeus and Hera. The parentage is not only historical, is not only the genealogical fact of the mythology. It is the ongoing relation, the ongoing quality of the daughter who grew up in the most complicated household, and who carries from that household the specific things it gave her. From Zeus she carries the sense of the vast scale of things, the understanding that what she governs is not small even when it appears small, that the renewal she provides sustains the cosmos in ways that are not immediately visible, but that are genuine. She is her father's daughter in the willingness to hold what she holds with the authority of the one who knows its importance. From Hera she carries the understanding of the binding, the structured, the relation that is maintained over the long time, through the sustained commitment to what is real rather than what is convenient. Hera's domain was the marriage and the household and the legitimate structure, and in these things she was formidable beyond what the mythology usually credited. The daughter carries this, the understanding that the ordinary relations, the household, the marriage, the daily maintained commitment, are among the most significant things in the world, that their ordinariness is not their diminishment. From both of them she carries the specific quality of the divine household on Olympus, the brightness, the magnitude, the ongoing life of the most extraordinary family in the universe. She grew up in this brightness. She is shaped by it. She carries it in the quality of her presence, which has the warmth of the divine household's best quality, without the complications that the divine household's full reality involved. She is the daughter. She will always be the daughter. The parentage is the foundation. Chapter 31. Youth as Resistance. She has come to understand that her domain was not only the gentle thing, not only the warm and refreshing and comfortable, it was also the resistant thing. Youth as resistance, the quality of the fresh start that refused to be worn down by the accumulated weight of what had been, that maintained the capacity for beginning again in the face of the accumulated evidence that beginning again was not always rewarded, that held the morning's freshness against the pressure of the long afternoon. The world was full of the pressures that wore, the experience that accumulated and became the thick lens through which the new was always filtered, the grief that settled into the condition of the self, the disappointment that became the expectation of disappointment, the long practice of the managed response that protected the self from being moved, but also protected the self from being alive. She was the resistance to these pressures, not by denying their reality. The wearing was real. The accumulation was real. The long afternoon was genuinely long. But by maintaining the availability of the morning, regardless of how long the afternoon had been, by keeping the cup full, regardless of how many times it had been emptied, This was not passive. This was the active work of the renewal, the sustained, daily, renewed commitment to the possibility of the fresh start. The work of being the goddess of youth was the work of insisting on the possibility of beginning again, of maintaining the quality of the not yet worn, in the face of everything that pushed toward the worn. She did this work. She had always done this work. The cup was full because she made it full. The resistance was part of the gift. The insistence on the morning was a form of love. Chapter 32. The last thought on the cup. There is a final thing to say about the cup, and it is the simplest thing, and the thing that contains all the other things. The cup is offered, always, to everyone, without condition. She does not decide who deserves the renewal and who does not. She does not evaluate the worthiness of the receiver before she fills the cup. She does not reserve the fresh morning for the ones who have earned it through their excellent behavior or their dramatic achievements or their historical significance. The morning comes to everyone. The spring comes everywhere. The cup is offered to whoever is there. This is the deepest thing about her domain. It is unconditional. The renewal is available to the god who has governed well, and the god who has governed badly, and the mortal who has been heroic, and the mortal who has been ordinary, and the being who has been good, and the being who has not been good. The morning comes to all of them. She gives it to all of them. Not because the differences between them do not matter. They matter. And the other gods who governed justice and consequence and the management of those differences were right to attend to them. But her domain was not the domain of the differential. Her domain was the unconditional gift. The morning that comes to all, the spring that returns everywhere, the renewal that is available to anyone who can receive it. She offers the cup. She has always offered the cup. She will always offer the cup. To you reading this, to the one who will read this after you, to the one who will never read this and who will receive the morning anyway, not knowing whose morning it is. The cup is full. It is offered. Epilogue. What the cup is for. There is something that needs to be said about Hebe, that the mythology said almost not at all, and that needs to be said fully. She was not minor. The mythology made her minor, gave her a function, noted it in the genealogies, mentioned the stumble and the replacement and the marriage, and moved on to the more dramatic things. The mythology was organized around the dramatic, and she was not dramatic, and so she was minor. She was not minor. She was the condition of the divine life. She was what made the ongoing possible. She was the cup that was always full, and the morning that always came, and the spring that always returned. She was the renewal without which the Olympians could not have sustained the divine project, without which the mortal world could not have sustained the human project, without which the very continuity of existence. The fact that the next day followed the last day with the capacity to be a new day, rather than only an extension of the worn day, would not have been possible. She was necessary in the deepest sense, not necessary as the function that could be replaced, not necessary in the way that the stumble had suggested she might be necessary, the function that could be transferred to the next cupbearer. Necessary as the principle, as the divine reality, as the thing itself that could not be replaced, because it was the thing. She was the morning, not a morning goddess, not the one who drove the sun's chariot or personified the dawn. The morning as a quality, the morning as the possibility of beginning again, the morning as the cup that was full when you needed it. She was youth, not the phase, not the demographic category, not the brief window before the long afternoon. The quality of youth that was renewable, that was available at every age and in every condition. That was the capacity to receive the world as if it were new. She was the cup, not the vessel, not any specific cup. The cup as the gift, as the offering, as the thing brought by caring hands to where it was needed, full of what was needed, given without condition. She was Hebe. She was more than the mythology knew how to say. She is the cup in your hands. She is the morning at your window. She is the spring that is coming. She is the renewal that is available, always, without condition. Drink. Here ends the story of Hebe, daughter of Zeus and Hera, goddess of youth, cupbearer of the gods, wife of Heracles, keeper of the renewal that makes all the rest possible. She is in the morning. She is in the spring. She is in the cup that is offered. She is in the beginning again. The cup is full. It was always full. She made sure of it.